"Mom, why does that man look exactly like me?" The question landed softly in the quiet airport lounge, but it struck Charlotte Hayes harder than any scream ever could. For a moment, she forgot how to breathe. The television, mounted above Gate 14, flickered against the dark glass windows of Melbourne International Airport, casting cold blue light across rows of exhausted travelers curled over backpacks and half-finished coffees. Outside, rain streaked across the runway in silver lines while distant aircraft lights blinked through the storm like fading stars. Charlotte sat frozen beneath the fluorescent glow, one hand wrapped around a paper cup gone cold hours ago, the other resting protectively over her daughter's sleeping shoulder. Her twins had fallen asleep beside her sometime after midnight, curled together across the uncomfortable airport seats beneath threadbare jackets that still carried the faint scent of lavender detergent. Liam pointed toward the television again, his sleepy blue eyes fixed on the man standing in front of dozens of flashing cameras. "See," he whispered. "His eyes look like mine." Charlotte slowly lifted her gaze toward the screen, and the world around her seemed to narrow into a dull, ringing silence. Ethan Callaway stood beneath the gold lights of a ballroom in Sydney, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent. The caption below him read, "Australia's most powerful soon, who donates $20 million to Children's Hospital." Cameras flashed across his sharp features while reporters pushed microphones toward him. 10 years had changed him. The boy she once loved had disappeared beneath broader shoulders, silver threading faintly through dark hair, and the controlled expression of a man who had spent years learning how not to feel anything publicly. But his eyes had not changed. Steel blue, calm, devastating. The exact same eyes staring back at her every morning across the breakfast table through her son's face. Charlotte's stomach tightened painfully. "Just a coincidence, sweetheart," she said softly, forcing a smile she did not feel. Liam frowned slightly. "But he really does." Sophie stirred, beside her twin, rubbing her eyes as airport announcements echoed overhead. "Are we boarding yet?" she mumbled. "Another 40 minutes." Charlotte tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her daughter's ear and reached for the worn backpack at her feet. The zipper had broken months ago, tied together now with pink ribbon from Sophie's last school recital. Beside her shoes sat a plastic shopping bag carrying sandwiches she had packed herself to avoid paying airport prices. Everything about her life required calculation now. Every dollar, every hour, every sacrifice. Across the terminal, a businessman in an expensive navy coat complained loudly into his phone about delayed flights, while a cleaner pushed a rattling trolley through the polished corridor. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried briefly before being soothed back to sleep. The airport smelled faintly of burnt coffee and rain-soaked coats. Charlotte pulled her cardigan tighter around herself, suddenly cold despite the overheated terminal. She had spent years convincing herself Ethan Callaway belonged to another lifetime. Another woman, another version of herself. But seeing him again, even through a television screen, reopened something she had spent a decade burying beneath survival. 10 years earlier, she had stood inside St. Augustine's Cathedral wearing a white satin gown her mother spent 6 months sewing by hand because they couldn't afford designer couture. She still remembered the weight of the veil against her shoulders, the nervous excitement in her chest, the way guests smiled sympathetically as the ceremony started 20 minutes late, then 40, then an hour, until whispers began floating through the pews like smoke. "Where is he? Did something happen? Has anyone called him?" Charlotte remembered gripping her bouquet so tightly that rose thorns pierced her fingertips beneath the ribbon wrapping. She remembered pretending not to notice the pity in people's eyes. But most of all, she remembered the moment Ethan's mother approached her quietly near the altar. Elegant, controlled, avoiding eye contact. "Charlotte," she had whispered gently, "you should go home." No explanation, no apology, just those 4 words that shattered her future in front of everyone she knew. Ethan never came. Not that day, not the next, not ever. By the time she discovered she was pregnant weeks later, every newspaper in Sydney was already celebrating Ethan Callaway's rise inside his father's billion-dollar empire. She learned very quickly that powerful families could erase inconvenient people without leaving fingerprints behind. "Mom," Sophie's sleepy voice pulled her back into the present. "You look pale." Charlotte blinked quickly and forced another smile. "I'm okay, darling." But she wasn't. Because on the television screen above them, Ethan smiled politely at a reporter before turning slightly toward the cameras, and Liam unconsciously mirrored the exact same expression while reaching for his juice box. The same half-smile, the same tilt of the head, even the same tiny crease beside the left eye. Charlotte felt something crack quietly inside her chest. For years, she had managed to protect them from questions, from disappointment, from the truth. The twins knew their father had left before they were born. They knew he had been someone Mom used to love. Nothing more. She had never shown them photographs, never spoken his name aloud. Yet genetics had preserved him anyway. In Liam's eyes, in Sophie's stubborn determination, in the little habits they inherited from a man who had never held them once. The television host continued speaking excitedly about Ethan's newest business acquisition while images flashed across the screen of luxury offices, charity galas, and waterfront mansions. A life so impossibly far from hers now, it almost felt fictional. Charlotte looked down at her children sleeping beside her on stiff airport chairs beneath flickering fluorescent lights, and exhaustion washed over her bones like heavy rain. She had spent 10 years building a life from nothing. 10 years working flower markets before sunrise, cleaning offices at night, stitching school uniforms by hand to save money, smiling through exhaustion because her children deserved warmth even when life gave her very little. And somehow, despite all of it, they had grown into kind children. Gentle children. The kind who thanked waiters and shared lunches and hugged her when they thought she looked tired. Ethan Calloway might have inherited their faces, but he did not shape their hearts. Final boarding announcements echoed through the terminal as passengers slowly began gathering their bags. Charlotte rose carefully, lifting their worn carry-on suitcase whose wheels squeaked loudly against the polished floor. Liam grabbed her hand automatically while Sophie leaned sleepily against her shoulder. Above them, Ethan's interview continued silently on the glowing screen. For one dangerous second, Charlotte allowed herself to wonder if he had ever searched for her. If he ever regretted what happened. If he even remembered the girl standing alone in a cathedral while rain battered stained glass windows outside. But then Sophie squeezed her hand gently, and the thought disappeared. Some wounds did not heal. They simply learned how to breathe quietly inside you. The rain had followed them all the way into the city. Thin streams of water crawled down the tram windows as Melbourne drifted past in blurred reflections of neon signs, closed cafes, and exhausted commuters hurrying beneath umbrellas. Charlotte sat near the back beside the twins, one hand gripping the metal pole every time the tram lurched around a corner while the other rested protectively over the envelope in her lap. Inside it was the contract that could change everything. Liam leaned sleepily against her shoulder while Sophie stared out the rain-speckled glass at the glowing skyline. "Do you think rich people are awake this late?" Sophie asked quietly. Charlotte smiled faintly. "Rich people never sleep, sweetheart. They just call it networking." Sophie giggled softly before yawning again. Across from them, two university students scrolled through their phones while a man in work boots snored quietly near the rear doors. The tram smelled faintly of wet coats and takeaway chips. Charlotte checked the time on her cracked phone screen and exhaled slowly. Nearly 1 in the morning. The twins had school tomorrow. She had deliveries at the flower market by 6. And somehow, between all of it, she still needed to prepare centerpieces for the biggest event her tiny floral studio had ever booked. Calloway Holdings' annual charity gala. Even thinking the name made something uncomfortable tighten beneath her ribs. She had almost declined the job the moment she received the email 3 weeks earlier. But then she looked at overdue electricity bills taped beside her fridge. Liam's school excursion form sitting unsigned because she could not afford the fee. Sophie pretending not to notice the holes forming in her ballet slippers. Pride did not pay rent. Flowers did. "Mom." Liam's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Can I ask something?" "Always." He hesitated carefully. "If Dad saw us now, do you think he would like us?" Charlotte's fingers tightened slightly around the envelope. Children always found the questions adults spent years avoiding. She looked down at her son's face, at Ethan's eyes staring back at her with innocent uncertainty, and felt the familiar ache settle inside her chest. "He would love you," she said softly. "Anyone would." Liam nodded quietly, though she could tell the answer had not fully satisfied him. Sophie crossed her arms dramatically beside them. "Well, if he left Mom, then he sounds stupid anyway." Charlotte almost laughed despite herself. Sophie had inherited her stubbornness with frightening accuracy. Life is complicated sometimes, Charlotte murmured. People make choices they regret. The tram slowed near Flinders Street Station with a sharp metallic screech. Outside, rain hammered the pavement beneath yellow streetlights while distant sirens echoed somewhere deeper in the city. Charlotte gathered their bags carefully, helping the twins pull on jackets before stepping onto the wet platform. Cold wind instantly swept through her hair. Sophie grabbed her hand while Liam carried the small flower sample box balanced carefully against his chest. Careful, Charlotte warned gently. Those roses cost more than my dignity. Liam grinned sleepily. Everything costs more than your dignity according to you. That is because dignity does not come with tax. The twins laughed together as they crossed the slick pavement toward the apartment blocks 3 streets away. Their building sat above an old convenience shop with flickering lights and a permanently broken buzzer downstairs. The stairwell smelled faintly of dust and fried food from the takeaway shop next door. Charlotte climbed the stairs slowly, exhaustion pulling heavily through her limbs. By the time they reached apartment 4B, Sophie was practically asleep, standing up. The tiny flat greeted them with silence and darkness. Charlotte flicked on the kitchen light, revealing peeling wallpaper, mismatched furniture, and school drawings taped proudly across the fridge. Small, worn, but theirs. Sophie disappeared immediately toward the bedroom, while Liam carefully placed the flower sample box onto the counter. "Do you need help tomorrow?" he asked. Charlotte brushed damp hair from his forehead. "You already help enough. I am nearly 10. Exactly. Your job is football and annoying your sister." Liam smiled proudly at that before finally heading toward bed. A few minutes later, the apartment fell quiet except for distant rain tapping softly against the windows. Charlotte remained alone in the kitchen, slowly unpacking flowers beneath the weak yellow light overhead. White roses, baby's breath, pale orchids imported from Singapore that she absolutely could not afford to damage. Her fingers moved automatically through the arrangements while her mind drifted somewhere far more dangerous. Ethan Calloway. She had spent 10 years training herself not to think his name. Not late at night. Not when she felt lonely. Not during birthdays when Liam laughed exactly like him. Not during school concerts when Sophie searched crowds for a father who never came. But tonight had cracked something open. Seeing him again on that television screen had felt like watching a ghost step back into the world. Older, colder, untouchable, yet painfully familiar. Charlotte reached for scissors before suddenly freezing as a memory surfaced without warning. Ethan standing barefoot in their tiny Bondi apartment years earlier, attempting to cook pancakes while flour covered his black shirt. Laughing when he burned them completely. Pulling her into his arms while sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor. "We are going to build a beautiful life," he had whispered against her hair. Back then, she believed him completely. A sudden buzzing sound snapped her back into the present. Charlotte blinked quickly and reached for her phone beside the sink. Unknown number. Her stomach tightened instinctively. Very few good things arrived after midnight from unknown numbers. She hesitated before answering softly. "Hello, Miss Hayes." The voice was polished and professional. Female. Calm. "This is Victoria Bennett from Callaway Holdings." Charlotte's pulse stumbled once against her ribs. "Yes. I apologize for the late call. There has been a slight adjustment regarding tomorrow evening's gala." Charlotte immediately glanced toward the flowers spread across her kitchen bench. "Is something wrong with the arrangements?" "No, not at all. Mr. Calloway personally reviewed your floral portfolio this evening." The room suddenly felt much smaller. And there was the briefest pause. "He has requested that you oversee the ballroom installation in person tomorrow night." Charlotte's fingers slowly tightened around the phone. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the city while rain continued sliding down the apartment windows like tears. "I usually deliver and leave before events begin," she said carefully. Mr. Calloway was very specific. The woman's tone remained perfectly polite. He would like to meet the florist personally. Charlotte felt all the warmth drain quietly from her body. For 10 years, Ethan Calloway had been a closed chapter she survived by never reopening. And now somehow, impossibly, fate was pulling her directly back toward him. Charlotte barely slept. The storm outside weakened sometime before dawn, but the tension sitting beneath her ribs remained sharp and restless long after the rain stopped. By 5:30 in the morning, she was already standing inside the South Melbourne flower market beneath fluorescent warehouse lights, while forklifts rattled across concrete floors around her. The air smelled of eucalyptus, damp cardboard, and fresh roses. Vendors shouted prices over one another, while delivery vans lined the loading bays outside in the cold morning fog. Charlotte adjusted the sleeves of her oversized knit jumper and carefully inspected white orchids beneath the harsh lights. Every stem mattered tonight. Every arrangement needed to look perfect, because wealthy people noticed flowers the same way ordinary people noticed unpaid bills. "Morning, love," called old Mr. Russo from the neighboring stall. The elderly florist carried 2 buckets overflowing with peonies while his reading glasses slipped down his nose. "You look exhausted." Charlotte smiled faintly. "That is because I am exhausted. Big event tonight." "Unfortunately." Mr. Russo chuckled knowingly. "The rich are exhausting before they even arrive." Charlotte laughed softly despite herself, but the sound faded quickly. Her phone buzzed inside her coat pocket. School reminder. Sophie needed permission slips, signed by tomorrow morning. Liam needed new football boots before next month's tournament. Another list of things she could not afford to forget. Across the market floor, workers rolled carts stacked with lilies toward refrigerated trucks, while early sunlight slowly bled through the warehouse windows. Charlotte inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself. She had survived far worse than one awkward meeting with Ethan Callaway. 10 years ago, she survived humiliation in front of hundreds of wedding guests. She survived labor alone inside a public hospital while staring at a silent phone that never rang. She survived nights crying quietly in the bathroom because she could not let newborn twins hear fear in her voice. Compared to all of that, tonight should have been easy, yet her hands still trembled slightly while arranging flowers. "Mom!" Sophie's voice suddenly echoed through the market. Charlotte turned just as the twins hurried toward her between delivery crates wearing school uniforms slightly too large from last year. Liam carried takeaway toast wrapped in napkins while Sophie balanced 3 hot chocolates dangerously in her arms. "You forgot breakfast again," Sophie announced dramatically. "Which means we are officially parenting ourselves now." Charlotte smiled despite the heaviness inside her chest. "I raised you to be emotionally supportive, and this is what I get." Liam handed her the toast carefully. "Mr. Russo said adults stop functioning without caffeine after 30. Mr. Russo is a terrible influence. He also gave us free Lamingtons. Then he is a national hero." The twins laughed together while Charlotte looked at them quietly for a moment. Morning light caught Sophie's golden hair, while Liam absent-mindedly mirrored Ethan's habit of rubbing the back of his neck when tired. Small details. Tiny inherited gestures that still startled her after all these years. "Do you have the fancy party tonight?" Sophie asked between sips of chocolate. Charlotte nodded. "Biggest event I have ever done." "Will celebrities be there?" "Probably." Liam's eyes widened slightly. "What about football players?" "No idea." Sophie grinned mischievously. "Maybe Mum will marry a billionaire tonight." Charlotte nearly choked on her coffee. "Absolutely not." "Why not?" Sophie shrugged innocently. "Then we could have a swimming pool." "We are not marrying strangers for swimming pools." Liam considered that carefully. "What if he is really nice and the pool is heated?" Charlotte laughed before she could stop herself. For one brief moment, the weight pressing against her chest eased slightly. The twins always did that somehow. They made difficult things feel survivable. An hour later, after kissing both children goodbye outside school gates, Charlotte stood alone beside her delivery, then staring at the city skyline through drifting morning clouds. Somewhere inside those towers, Ethan Callaway was beginning another day entirely unaware his children had argued about hypothetical swimming pools over breakfast. Or maybe he knew. The thought appeared suddenly and uninvited. Charlotte immediately pushed it away. If Ethan had wanted to find her, he would have. Powerful men always found what mattered to them. Her phone buzzed again. This time the screen displayed an email notification from Callaway Holdings. Final event schedule attached. Charlotte hesitated before opening it. Her stomach tightened instantly. VIP reception ballroom, level 7. Floral installation supervision required until event commencement. Direct coordination with Mr. Ethan Callaway requested. She stared at the words while traffic moved loudly around her. Requested. Not required. Not necessary. Requested. After 10 years of silence, Ethan suddenly wanted to meet the woman he abandoned at the altar. Charlotte locked her phone immediately and leaned back against the van, closing her eyes briefly. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe he had no idea who she was when reviewing floral vendors. Hayes' floral studio was tiny. Forgettable. There was no reason he would connect it to Charlotte Hayes from a decade ago. But deep down, she already knew Ethan too well to believe in coincidence. Ethan noticed details. Always had. That was part of what made him dangerous. By late afternoon, the ballroom inside Crown Melbourne glowed beneath gold chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Yarra River. Staff hurried across polished marble floors carrying trays of champagne, while event coordinators barked instructions into headsets. The entire space smelled faintly of expensive perfume, fresh flowers, and polished wood. Charlotte stood near the center staircase adjusting white orchids around a crystal centerpiece nearly taller than she was. Every arrangement shimmered softly beneath the lights like something pulled from a dream. Absolutely stunning. Charlotte turned sharply at the sound of the familiar male voice behind her. Deep, calm, effortlessly controlled. Her pulse stumbled instantly. Ethan Calloway stood only a few feet away wearing a charcoal suit beneath the ballroom lights, one hand tucked loosely into his pocket while executives hovered respectfully several steps behind him. Time had sharpened him somehow. He looked older than the man she once loved, but also more dangerous, more guarded. The kind of man who spent years building walls nobody else could climb. But the moment his eyes settled fully on her face, something inside his carefully controlled expression cracked almost invisibly. Silence stretched between them beneath the glittering chandeliers, while waiters moved quietly around the ballroom preparing for hundreds of guests who would arrive within the hour. Charlotte felt, suddenly aware of everything at once. Her heartbeat, her breathing, the sound of ice clinking inside champagne glasses nearby. Ethan stared at her like someone seeing a ghost walk back into the world. Then finally, softly, almost disbelievingly, he spoke her name for the first time in 10 years. Charlotte. Charlotte forgot how to move. The ballroom noise faded into something distant and underwater while Ethan stood across from her beneath the crystal chandeliers, staring as though the last decade had collapsed into a single impossible moment. Around them, staff continued arranging champagne towers and adjusting silver place, cards completely unaware that two people's entire past had just collided in the center of the room. Ethan took one slow step closer. It really is you. His voice remained calm, but Charlotte heard the fracture underneath it. The disbelief, the regret, the memory. She forced herself to breathe evenly. Good evening, Mr. Calloway. The formality visibly hit him harder than anger would have. His jaw tightened slightly before he glanced toward the executives lingering behind him. Give us a minute. They disappeared immediately without question. Of course they did. Powerful men were rarely told no. Silence settled between them once more. Charlotte adjusted a white orchid stem that did not actually need adjusting simply to keep her hands occupied. Ethan watched her carefully, as if afraid she might disappear if he blinked too long. You own this company? She asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. Ethan gave the faintest, humorless smile. Apparently. Charlotte nodded once. Congratulations. The words sounded strange coming from her mouth. Congratulations for becoming the billionaire everyone expected him to become. Congratulations for choosing ambition over love and winning exactly what he wanted. Except something inside his expression suggested victory had not brought him peace. Ethan glanced around the ballroom slowly. These flowers are incredible. Thank you. You always loved orchids. Charlotte's fingers paused briefly against the arrangement. He remembered. After 10 years, he still remembered tiny details she had. Convinced herself no longer mattered. Ethan stepped closer to one centerpiece, studying the soft white petals beneath the golden light. You used to say orchids looked elegant even when they were struggling to survive. Charlotte swallowed carefully. People say strange things in their 20s. A faint sadness crossed his face. You still make jokes when you are nervous. The observation landed too accurately. Charlotte straightened immediately. I should finish preparing before guests arrive. She turned toward another arrangement, but Ethan's next words stopped her instantly. Charlotte, I looked for you. Her heartbeat stumbled painfully. Slowly, she faced him again. Ethan's eyes held hers steadily now, stripped of corporate polish and public confidence. For the first time since seeing him again, He looked less like Australia's most powerful businessman and more like the man who once danced with her barefoot in their tiny kitchen at midnight. After the wedding, he continued quietly, I came back. Charlotte stared at him in disbelief. What? 3 weeks later. His voice lowered further. I went to your flat in Bondi. You were gone. The room suddenly felt too warm. Charlotte folded her arms tightly across herself. Your mother paid the landlord to terminate my lease. Ethan visibly froze. What? She said it would be easier for everyone if I disappeared quietly. Pain flickered sharply across his face. Real pain. Charlotte, I did not know that. Of course you did not. Her voice remained calm, but barely. People like your family never notice the damage once cleaners remove it. Ethan exhaled slowly and looked away for the first time. Beyond the ballroom windows, the Yarra River shimmered beneath the evening skyline, while luxury cars lined the entrance below. Everything around him reflected power, wealth, control. Yet suddenly he looked strangely exhausted inside all of it. You vanished, he said quietly. I searched for months. Charlotte almost laughed. You left me standing alone in a cathedral, Ethan. His eyes closed briefly at the memory. I know. Do you? Her voice sharpened for the first time. Because I remember every single minute of that day. Ethan opened his eyes again, and the guilt inside them felt almost unbearable to look at. Then hate me, he whispered. You would have every right. Charlotte looked at him carefully then. Really looked at him. The expensive suit. The silver beginning near his temples. The faint exhaustion beneath controlled eyes. This was not the reckless young man she once loved. Time had carved regret into him quietly. Yet none of it changed what happened. I do not hate you, she admitted softly. That would have been easier. Ethan stared at her like the words physically hurt. Before either of them could speak again, ballroom doors suddenly burst open behind them. Mom! Charlotte turned immediately as Liam and Sophie hurried into the room, wearing school uniforms and oversized visitor badges hanging around their necks. Panic flashed across her face. What are you two doing here? Sophie stopped short beside her mother, slightly breathless. Mrs. Russo downstairs said you forgot your sketchbook. Liam held up the worn leather folder proudly before both children noticed Ethan standing nearby. Silence fell instantly. Ethan's entire body went still. Charlotte felt it happen before she even looked at him. The room changed. Shifted. Like oxygen disappearing quietly from the air. Liam stared openly at Ethan with innocent curiosity, while Sophie moved protectively closer to Charlotte's side. Under the ballroom lights, the resemblance became impossible to ignore. The same blue eyes. The same shape of the smile. Even the exact same posture when standing uncertainly. Ethan looked at Liam as though someone had reached inside his chest and stopped his heart. Charlotte's pulse thundered painfully in her ears. This was not how she imagined it happening. Not here. Not like this. Liam tilted his head slightly. Oh. Sophie frowned beside him. What? Liam looked between Ethan and the television posters displayed around the ballroom entrance. That is the man from the airport. Ethan's breathing visibly changed. Just slightly. But Charlotte noticed. Of course she noticed. She used to know every shift in his expression before he even spoke. Sophie crossed her arms carefully, studying Ethan with suspicious blue eyes. You do look weirdly similar. Sophie, Charlotte warned softly. But Ethan never looked away from Liam. The color had drained slowly from his face beneath the ballroom lights, while realization unfolded silently behind his eyes. 10 years. 10 years of absence collapsing into one impossible truth standing directly in front of him. Liam smiled politely the way Charlotte raised him to. Hi, Mr. Calloway. Ethan swallowed hard before finally answering, his voice quieter than before. Hello. Liam glanced up at Charlotte. Mum says your company owns half of Melbourne. Under any other circumstances, Ethan might have smiled. But now he looked like a man trying desperately to remain standing while his entire world shifted beneath him. His gaze flickered slowly toward Charlotte, then back to the twins again. And in that devastating silence, she realized the exact moment Ethan Calloway understood he had not only lost the woman he loved 10 years ago. He had lost an entire family. The ballroom suddenly felt too small for breathing. Ethan stood motionless beneath the gold chandeliers while conversations and footsteps echoed faintly around them. Yet all he seemed capable of seeing were the two children standing beside Charlotte. Liam shifted the sketchbook awkwardly beneath his arm, while Sophie narrowed her eyes with cautious suspicion that reminded Charlotte painfully of herself. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on them both, like a man staring directly at 10 years of lost time. Charlotte stepped forward instinctively, placing herself slightly between him and the twins without even realizing she had done it. Ethan noticed. Of course he noticed. The movement landed across his face like another wound. "You have children," he said finally, though the words sounded almost meaningless now that the truth stood directly in front of him. Charlotte's voice remained steady. "Yes." Ethan looked at Liam again, then Sophie, then back to Charlotte. His expression shifted slowly from confusion into something far more devastating. Understanding. "How old are they?" The question barely escaped him. Charlotte hesitated only briefly. 9. Ethan inhaled sharply. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just one quiet breath that sounded like his entire world had tilted sideways. Liam glanced between the adults uncertainly. "Mom." Charlotte forced herself to stay calm. "Why do not you two wait by the reception table for a minute?" Sophie immediately frowned. "Are we in trouble?" "No, darling." Charlotte brushed her daughter's hair gently behind her ear. "I just need to finish talking to Mr. Calloway." Sophie clearly did not like the idea, but Liam nodded politely and guided his sister toward the ballroom entrance. Halfway across the room, Liam turned back once more and offered Ethan a small smile before disappearing through the crowd. Ethan watched him go like a man watching sunlight disappear after years underground. The silence afterward felt enormous. Charlotte folded her arms tightly across herself while waiters moved around them carrying silver trays beneath glittering chandeliers. Somewhere nearby, a violin quartet rehearsed softly for the gala opening. Elegant music floating through the wreckage of two people's lives. Ethan finally looked at her again, and there was no corporate composure left in his face now. Only shock. "They are mine." It was not a question. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly before answering. "Yes." Ethan physically staggered backward one small step. The reaction was so raw and immediate that for one dangerous second, Charlotte almost felt sorry for him. Almost. His hand moved to the edge of a nearby table as though grounding himself against something solid. "My God." Charlotte stared at the polished marble floor rather than his face. "I did not tell them who you were." Ethan swallowed hard. "Why?" That question finally ignited something inside her. "Why?" She laughed once softly, but there was no humor in it. "You disappeared, Ethan." His eyes closed briefly. "Charlotte." No, her voice sharpened instantly. "You do not get to look wounded now." Nearby staff members glanced toward them before quickly pretending not to notice. Wealthy events trained people to ignore uncomfortable emotions. Ethan lowered his voice further. "I came back for you." 3 weeks later. Tears burned suddenly behind her eyes, but Charlotte refused to let them fall. "Do you know what happened during those 3 weeks?" Ethan said nothing. "I sat in our apartment every night staring at the door like an idiot." Her breathing trembled despite every effort to steady it. "I defended you to everyone. My mother, my friends, even strangers." Ethan looked physically sick now. "Charlotte." "Then your mother arrived." She folded her arms tighter. "She told me your father threatened to destroy your future if you married me." Ethan's face drained further. "She told you that?" "She told me I was a distraction." Charlotte smiled bitterly. A florist from a poor family embarrassing the future of the Calloway empire. Ethan looked away sharply, guilt written across every line of his face. "I never wanted any of that. But you chose it anyway." Silence. Heavy and undeniable. Across the ballroom, event coordinators rushed between tables while guests slowly began arriving beneath flashes from photographers near the entrance. The glamorous noise around them felt grotesquely disconnected from the conversation unfolding in the center of it. Ethan finally spoke again, quieter now. "You were pregnant." Charlotte nodded once. "I found out 11 days after the wedding." Ethan pressed a hand against his mouth briefly, his eyes unfocused like he was trying to process the missing decade all at once. "Why did you not tell me?" Charlotte stared at him in disbelief. "Tell you where?" The question hit with brutal simplicity. Ethan had no answer because there was none. Charlotte continued softly now, exhaustion replacing anger. "Your number changed. Your family blocked every attempt I made to contact you. By the time I realized what was happening, every newspaper in Sydney was calling you the youngest executive director in company history." She shook her head faintly. "You looked very happy." Ethan's eyes filled instantly with something painful and broken. I was never happy. Charlotte looked away before his expression could weaken her resolve. That was the dangerous thing about Ethan. Even after everything, part of her still remembered the boy underneath the billionaire. The boy who used to kiss flour from her cheek while dancing in tiny kitchens. The boy who once whispered that she was his home. Did they ever ask about me? Ethan asked carefully. Charlotte already knew who he meant. The twins. Every birthday. Her voice softened despite herself. Every Christmas. Every school concert where other children had fathers in the audience. Ethan looked shattered. Charlotte. Liam used to leave the hallway light on when he was little. Tears finally slipped down before she could stop them. Because he thought maybe his dad just could not find the apartment at night. Ethan closed his eyes like the words physically hurt. Charlotte wiped her face quickly, furious with herself for crying here of all places. Sophie stopped asking entirely after she turned 6. She said if someone really loved you, they would not leave. Ethan's breathing visibly shook now. The mighty Ethan Callaway, Australia's untouchable billionaire, standing speechless beside crystal centerpieces while the truth dismantled him piece by piece. I would have stayed, he whispered hoarsely, if I had known about them. I swear to you, Charlotte, I would have stayed. Charlotte looked at him for a very long moment. Then finally, quietly, she answered with the saddest truth of all. That does not change the fact that you did not. Before Ethan could respond, Sophie suddenly reappeared beside the ballroom entrance holding Liam's hand tightly. Mom, she called softly. The lady at reception says famous people are arriving. Charlotte quickly wiped her face and turned toward her children. Ethan looked at them again, and something inside his expression transformed completely this time. Not shock anymore. Not confusion. Something deeper. Fiercer. The unmistakable look of a man realizing he had just found the 2 most important people in the world 5 minutes after learning they existed. By 7:30, the ballroom had transformed into a world Charlotte barely recognized. Women in designer gowns drifted beneath crystal chandeliers holding champagne flutes while politicians, athletes, and media personalities moved through the room surrounded by expensive perfume and camera flashes. Laughter echoed softly against marble walls. Everything glittered. Everything looked effortless. Charlotte stood near the floral installation pretending to adjust orchids while her heart remained dangerously unsteady inside her chest. Across the ballroom, Ethan spoke quietly with board members near the stage, but his attention kept drifting back toward the twins sitting beside the dessert display, sharing a chocolate tart. Every few seconds, his eyes found them again like instinct. Like gravity, Charlotte noticed every single glance. So did Sophie. He keeps staring, her daughter whispered while swinging her legs beneath the velvet chair. Liam looked up from his dessert. Maybe he likes flowers. Sophie gave him a look usually reserved for deeply disappointing people. Nobody looks at flowers like that. Charlotte inhaled slowly. Sophie, what? I am observant. Liam glanced toward Ethan again. He does seem sad. The simple comment tightened something painfully inside Charlotte's chest. Because Ethan did look sad. Not publicly, of course. The rest of the ballroom still saw the untouchable billionaire smiling politely beside politicians and investors. But Charlotte knew him too well. She recognized the strain behind his posture, the slight delay before every answer, the way his hand occasionally pressed against the edge of tables as though grounding himself through shock. Ethan was unraveling quietly beneath the surface. A young event coordinator suddenly approached Charlotte, holding a clipboard. Miss Hayes. Charlotte stood immediately. Yes. Mr. Callaway requested premium seating for you and your children during the presentation tonight. Charlotte blinked in surprise. That is not necessary. He insisted. Of course he did. The coordinator smiled politely toward the twins. There is also a children's menu prepared specifically for them. Sophie's eyes widened immediately. Specific chips? Truffle fries, the coordinator answered proudly. Sophie looked deeply impressed. Liam frowned. What is a truffle? Rich people potatoes, Sophie whispered confidently. The coordinator hurried away before Charlotte could protest further. Across the ballroom, Ethan watched the interaction from a distance. Their eyes met briefly, and something passed silently between them. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something softer than anger. Charlotte looked away first. The gala presentation began 20 minutes later beneath dimmed lights and soft piano music. Guests settled into elegant round tables while giant screens illuminated the ballroom with images of children's hospitals and charity programs funded by Callaway Holdings. Charlotte sat reluctantly near the front beside the twins while waiters moved quietly between tables pouring sparkling water. Ethan stepped onto the stage to polite applause. The room shifted instantly around him. Confidence settled naturally into his posture beneath the spotlight, while cameras focused on his face from multiple angles. This was his world now. Controlled, polished, powerful. Yet Charlotte noticed the smallest hesitation before he began speaking. His gaze flickered briefly toward the twins. 10 years ago, Ethan said calmly into the microphone, "I believed success was about building something impressive enough that the world could not ignore you." His voice carried smoothly across the ballroom. But over time, I learned that success without people to share it with becomes very lonely. Something inside Charlotte tightened unexpectedly. Ethan rarely spoke emotionally in public. The media constantly described him as brilliant but distant. Cold, even. Yet tonight, there was something raw beneath his words. Children deserve stability, he continued quietly. They deserve safety, presence, love that stays. Charlotte's fingers slowly tightened around her napkin. Across the table, Liam listened attentively while Sophie focused mostly on the bread rolls. And unfortunately, Ethan said, "Some people realize what truly matters far too late." Silence settled softly through the ballroom after that line. Not dramatic silence. Thoughtful silence. Even reporters lowered their cameras slightly. Charlotte stared at Ethan beneath the stage lights and suddenly remembered the boy who once sat beside her on Bondi Beach talking about wanting a family before he turned 40. "I want noisy Christmas mornings," he had whispered back then, "and children running through the house while you yell at me for teaching them bad habits." The memory hit her so suddenly it almost hurt physically. Applause erupted across the ballroom as Ethan concluded the speech. Guests rose to their feet while photographers rushed closer to the stage. Ethan smiled politely for cameras, but his eyes found Charlotte again almost immediately. And this time, he looked at her with unmistakable regret. The rest of the evening passed in fragments of uncomfortable emotion. Influential guests approached Ethan constantly for conversations, while journalists requested interviews near the media wall. Yet somehow, despite the chaos surrounding him, Ethan continued finding excuses to remain near the twins. He sent over miniature desserts after Sophie admired them from across the room. He quietly arranged hot chocolate when Liam mentioned disliking sparkling water. At one point, Charlotte looked up to find Ethan kneeling beside their table, helping Sophie untangle the ribbon around a party favor bag, while Sophie explained the rules of netball with complete seriousness. The sight nearly stopped Charlotte's heart. Ethan listened to children carefully. Always had. He never spoke down to them. Never pretended interest. He genuinely cared. Sophie narrowed her eyes at him suspiciously while accepting the untangled ribbon. "You are nicer than television says." Ethan smiled faintly. "Television usually gets things wrong. Mom says rich people smile too much when cameras are around." Charlotte nearly choked on her drink. "Sophie." But Ethan laughed softly for the first time all evening. A real laugh. Warm. Brief. Familiar enough to make Charlotte's chest ache. Liam looked up at him curiously. "Did you really donate $20 million? "Yes." Liam's eyes widened. "That is heaps." Language, Charlotte corrected automatically. Ethan's smile deepened slightly. "It was definitely heaps." Sophie tilted her head carefully. "Why would somebody give away that much money?" Ethan looked at the twins for a long moment before answering quietly. "Because sometimes you spend years chasing the wrong things before realizing what actually matters." Charlotte felt the words settle heavily between them. Sophie accepted the answer with surprising seriousness before nodding once. "That makes sense." Nearby, flashes from photographers briefly illuminated the ballroom again, while musicians played soft jazz beneath the chandeliers. Yet somehow, despite the luxury surrounding them, Charlotte suddenly felt something dangerous beginning to happen. The twins were comfortable around Ethan. Too comfortable. And Ethan looked at them like a starving man discovering water after years in the desert. Then Liam smiled at Ethan again. That exact same Callaway smile Charlotte had fallen in love with at 21. And Ethan's entire expression softened so completely it nearly broke her heart. The gala ended just after 10:30, but But the city outside still glowed awake beneath rivers of rain-soaked lights and passing traffic. Guests drifted toward waiting luxury cars beneath the covered entrance, while hotel staff cleared champagne glasses and folded linen napkins inside the ballroom. Charlotte stood beside the floral displays, carefully packing and used orchids into transport boxes while exhaustion settled deep into her shoulders. Across the room, Sophie had fallen asleep curled sideways across two velvet chairs while Liam quietly built towers from leftover bread rolls beside her. The evening should have felt successful. It should have felt like victory. Her tiny floral studio had just serviced one of the most powerful corporate events in Melbourne without disaster. People praised her work all night. One politician's wife even asked for a business card. Yet Charlotte could not stop replaying the look on Ethan's face every time he glanced toward the twins. Like wonder mixed with grief. Like joy arriving hand in hand with punishment. "You missed a spot." Charlotte startled slightly at the familiar voice beside her. Ethan stood near the stage holding a folded suit jacket over one arm. His tie loosened now after hours of smiling for cameras and investors. Without the corporate crowd surrounding him, he looked strangely human again. Tired. Quiet. Real. Charlotte gestured toward a half-finished centerpiece. "I was getting to it." Ethan picked up a loose white orchid from the table carefully between his fingers. "You still twist the stems clockwise." She froze briefly. Years ago, he used to tease her about it constantly while helping arrange flowers in their Bondi flat before market weekends. Tiny details should not survive 10 years apart. Yet somehow they had. Charlotte continued packing silently. Ethan watched her for a long moment before speaking again. "Thank you for letting me spend time with them tonight." Her hands paused against the cardboard box. "They liked you." Ethan looked toward the twins immediately. Liam had fallen asleep beside Sophie now, his head resting awkwardly against the chair while one bread roll remained clutched in his hand. Ethan's entire expression softened at the sight. "They are incredible." Charlotte swallowed carefully. "They are good kids. You raised them well." Something painful flickered behind her ribs because he sounded sincere. Not performative. Not polite. Deeply sincere. Ethan slowly approached the sleeping twins, his footsteps quiet against the marble floor. Charlotte watched him kneel carefully beside Liam's chair like he was approaching something sacred. For several silent seconds, Ethan simply looked at his son. Really looked at him. The small freckles across his nose. The messy blonde hair falling over closed eyes. The exhausted little hand still holding bread from dinner. Ethan's own hand hovered briefly near Liam's shoulder before stopping halfway, uncertainty written across his face. He did not know if he had earned the right to touch his own child. The realization hurt Charlotte more than she expected. Ethan looked over at Sophie next, and something almost like a smile touched his mouth. Sophie slept curled protectively toward her brother, stubborn, even unconscious. "She is exactly like you," he whispered softly. Charlotte crossed her arms tightly. "Everyone says that." Ethan looked up at her then. "Do they know?" "No, no one." Charlotte shook her head slowly. "People know I was abandoned before my wedding. That story spread fast enough." Ethan's face tightened immediately. "Charlotte, but nobody knows about you." She lowered her voice carefully. "The twins deserve a normal childhood. Not headlines." Ethan nodded slowly, though the guilt inside his eyes deepened further. Across the ballroom, hotel staff dimmed several chandeliers while cleaners quietly wheeled carts toward the exits. The enormous room suddenly felt emptier. More intimate. Dangerous in a different way. Ethan stood again, slipping one hand into his pocket while studying her carefully. "You should not have had to do it alone." Charlotte gave a faint, tired laugh. "Well, life rarely checks if we are ready first." Ethan looked down briefly before speaking again. "There is something I never told you about the wedding." Charlotte stiffened immediately. "Ethan, please." The word came quietly, almost desperate. "Just let me explain once." She stared at him for several seconds before finally nodding once. Ethan exhaled slowly. 3 days before the wedding, my father discovered the company was under investigation. Charlotte frowned slightly. "For what?" "Financial fraud committed by one of the board directors." Ethan's jaw tightened faintly. If the scandal became public before the merger finalized, thousands of employees would have lost their jobs. The company would have collapsed. Charlotte folded her arms tighter. "And what did that have to do with me?" Pain crossed his face. "My father believed marrying you during the investigation would make me appear unstable to shareholders. She stared at him in disbelief. You left me because of shareholders? No, Ethan's voice sharpened instantly. I left because my father threatened to destroy your family if I did not. Silence. Heavy. Crushing. Charlotte blinked slowly. What? Ethan looked away toward the dark ballroom windows. Your mother's mortgage. Your brother's apprenticeship. Your florist supplier contracts. His expression twisted with self-disgust. He had people looking into every part of your life. Charlotte suddenly felt cold despite the heated room. He threatened us? Ethan nodded once. He told me if I married you, he would make sure your family lost everything. Charlotte's throat tightened painfully. So you decided for me. I thought I was protecting you. Ethan laughed softly then, but the sound carried no humor at all. Turns out I destroyed you anyway. Charlotte looked down at the sleeping twins, emotions twisting painfully through her chest. Anger, sadness, confusion, a decade of unanswered questions suddenly shifting beneath her feet. Why did you not tell me the truth? She whispered. Ethan's eyes filled with regret. Because I was 29 and terrified. He swallowed hard. And because my father convinced me that losing you quietly would hurt less than watching your life collapse publicly because of me. Charlotte stared at him beneath the dim ballroom lights, and for the first time in 10 years, she saw not the billionaire, not the man who abandoned her, just a frightened young man crushed beneath family power and impossible choices. It did not excuse what happened, but suddenly it made tragic sense. Ethan looked at the twins again, and his voice broke almost imperceptibly. I thought leaving you would save your future. His eyes slowly returned to Charlotte's face. I never imagined it would cost me my children. Before she could answer, Liam stirred sleepily in his chair and rubbed his eyes. Mom, he mumbled softly. Ethan instantly stepped back like instinct. Liam blinked up at him with exhausted confusion before smiling faintly. Oh, you are still here. Ethan's expression softened in a way Charlotte had never seen before. Not even years ago. Yeah, mate, he said quietly. I am still here. The rain had stopped by the time Charlotte and the twins stepped outside Crown Melbourne, but the city streets still shimmered beneath reflections of neon lights and passing traffic. Cool night air wrapped around them as hotel valets hurried between luxury cars lined along the entrance. Somewhere across the river, music drifted faintly from rooftop bars while ferries moved slowly along the dark water. Charlotte tightened her coat around herself and adjusted the strap of the flower supply bag hanging from her shoulder. Sophie yawned dramatically beside her. I am officially too tired to be polite anymore. Liam rubbed his eyes. You stopped being polite after the second dessert. That is, because rich people cake changes you. Charlotte smiled faintly despite the storm still turning quietly inside her chest. Behind them, glass doors opened softly. Ethan stepped outside carrying his suit jacket over one shoulder, while two security staff lingered discreetly near the entrance. The city lights reflected against wet pavement around him, making the entire moment feel strangely unreal. Charlotte immediately straightened slightly. Some instinct inside her still reacted to Ethan's presence even after everything. He looked toward the twins first. Always the twins now. You are taking the tram home? He asked quietly. Charlotte nodded. It is only 15 minutes. Ethan glanced toward the nearly empty street. At this hour? We do it all the time. The words escaped sharper than intended. Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Of course they did. Because while he spent years attending international business summits and charity galas, his children were catching late-night public transport through Melbourne rainstorms with their exhausted mother. Guilt moved visibly across his face again. Liam looked up at him curiously. Do rich people never use trams? Ethan blinked slightly before answering. I used to. Sophie crossed her arms. Before you became rich. Ethan almost smiled. Something like that. A black luxury car slowly pulled toward the curb beside them. The driver stepped out immediately holding an umbrella despite the rain already ending. Ethan ignored the umbrella entirely. His attention remained fixed on Charlotte. Let me drive you home. That is not necessary. Charlotte. His voice lowered carefully. Please. She hated that word coming from him now because part of her still remembered how gently he used to say it years ago. Sophie glanced between them suspiciously. Mom hates accepting help. Charlotte sighed softly. Thank you, darling. Very supportive. Liam looked toward the luxury car with open fascination. Does it have heated seats? Sophie gasped quietly. Imagine being warm on purpose. Ethan laughed softly again, and the sound startled Charlotte because it felt so familiar beneath the Melbourne night air. For one, dangerous. Second, it almost felt like before. Before cathedrals. Before silence. Before 10 years disappeared between them. 5 minutes, Ethan said quietly. That is all I am asking. Charlotte hesitated too long. Ethan noticed immediately. He always noticed hesitation. Weakness. Hope. Finally, she nodded once. Fine. Sophie looked personally victorious as they climbed into the car. I knew emotional manipulation would work eventually. You are 10, Charlotte muttered. You should not know what manipulation is. Internet. The interior smelled faintly of leather and cedarwood. Warm lighting glowed softly against polished surfaces while the city drifted silently beyond tinted windows. Liam immediately touched every button within reach before Charlotte stopped him. Ethan sat across from them rather than beside Charlotte, though his eyes kept drifting toward the twins like he still could not believe they were real. The drive remained quiet at first. Melbourne slid past outside in rivers of gold light and rain reflections, while late-night cafes emptied onto sidewalks beneath flickering signs. Sophie curled sleepily against Charlotte's shoulder, while Liam continued staring curiously at Ethan. Can I ask something? Liam finally said. Ethan looked up instantly. Anything. Why did you never have kids? Charlotte's stomach tightened painfully. Ethan went very still. Outside, traffic lights shifted from red to green across wet intersections. He paused carefully before answering. I thought I did not deserve them. Liam frowned slightly. That is weird. Ethan smiled faintly, though sadness lingered underneath it. Probably. Liam studied him for another moment. You would be a good dad, though. Silence filled the car immediately afterward. Sophie looked up sharply while Charlotte felt her throat tighten, without warning. Ethan stared at Liam like the child had unknowingly placed a knife directly into his chest. What makes you say that? He asked softly. Liam shrugged. You listen properly. Ethan blinked once and looked away toward the city lights outside the window. Charlotte saw his hand tighten briefly against his knee before relaxing again. Nobody spoke for nearly a full minute after that. Then Sophie suddenly lifted her head from Charlotte's shoulder. I still think Mom should marry somebody rich. Sophie. What? She protested sleepily. We could have 2 bathrooms. Ethan laughed quietly beneath his breath, while Charlotte covered her face briefly with one hand. I am begging you to stop discussing my romantic future with strangers. Sophie pointed toward Ethan. He is not a stranger anymore. The words settled heavily through the warm car interior. Ethan looked toward Charlotte slowly, something vulnerable flickering across his face again. Not hope exactly, but maybe the terrifying beginning of it. Charlotte immediately looked away toward the passing city outside. 15 minutes later, the car stopped outside the old apartment building above the convenience shop. The contrast felt almost cruel after leaving Crown Melbourne. Peeling paint, flickering stairwell lights, rusted balcony railings. Ethan stepped out first and looked up at the building in silence. Charlotte gathered the twins carefully while Sophie struggled to stay awake. Thank you for the ride, Charlotte said politely. Ethan nodded slowly, though his eyes remained fixed on the apartment building. You live here? Charlotte stiffened slightly. Yes. Ethan looked toward her then back, toward the building again. She could practically see the calculations happening behind his eyes. The realization that while he spent millions redesigning corporate offices, his children shared a tiny apartment above a convenience store. Guilt shadowed his expression instantly. Charlotte, do not. Her voice softened but remained firm. We are okay. Ethan looked at her carefully for a long moment. Then quietly, almost painfully, he said the one thing she least expected. You should have never had to struggle like this because of me. Charlotte's breath caught briefly. Because unlike pity, unlike guilt, unlike charity, those words sounded honest. Deeply honest. Sophie suddenly tugged sleepily on Charlotte's sleeve. Can Mr. Calloway come to my ballet recital? Silence crashed instantly between all of them. Charlotte stared at her daughter in complete shock while Liam's eyes widened beside her. Ethan looked frozen again. Sophie, Charlotte whispered carefully. But Sophie only shrugged. He asked proper questions about my dancing. She looked up at Ethan directly now. Most adults pretend to care. Ethan swallowed hard. When is it? Charlotte turned sharply toward him. Ethan. But he never looked away from Sophie. Saturday afternoon, Sophie answered softly. At the school hall. Ethan nodded once, almost reverently. Then I would love to come. Charlotte stared at him beneath the flickering apartment lights while something dangerous and impossible shifted quietly in the space between all four of them. Because for the first time in 10 years, Ethan Calloway was not looking at their family like a mistake from the past. He was looking at them like somewhere he desperately wanted to belong. Charlotte barely slept after that night. Long after the twins drifted off beneath mismatched blankets in the small bedroom they shared, she remained awake at the kitchen table staring at the city lights outside the rain-streaked window. The apartment hummed softly with old pipes and distant traffic while a cold cup of tea sat untouched beside unpaid electricity bills. Ethan's voice kept replaying in her mind. "I would love to come." Such a simple sentence. Yet somehow it had shaken her more than the shock of seeing him again. Because for the first time in 10 years, Ethan was no longer part of the past. He was suddenly standing at the edge of their everyday life. And that terrified her. Morning arrived gray and cold across Melbourne. Wind rattled the apartment windows while clouds hung low over the city skyline. Charlotte moved quietly through the kitchen packing school lunches before sunrise, her body running on exhaustion and routine. Peanut butter sandwiches, apple slices, juice boxes bought on special, the ordinary rhythm of survival. Sophie wandered into the kitchen first, still wrapped in her blanket like a tiny, exhausted queen. "I had a dream we lived in a mansion with 6 bathrooms. Charlotte handed her toast. "Aim higher. 7 bathrooms. Sophie smiled sleepily before climbing onto the chair beside the counter. "Do you think Mr. Calloway actually meant it?" Charlotte paused briefly. "Meant what?" "Coming Saturday." Charlotte focused carefully on slicing strawberries. "Probably." Sophie considered this seriously. Most adults say things they do not mean. The comment landed harder than Charlotte expected. Because children learn disappointment through repetition, through promises that never arrived. "Some adults keep their word," Charlotte said quietly. Sophie studied her mother's face for a moment before asking softly, "Was Dad the kind who did not?" Charlotte's hands stopped moving completely. Silence settled heavily between them while rain tapped faintly against the windows. Before she could answer, Liam appeared in the doorway wearing one sock and carrying a football under his arm. "Can famous people sign school absence notes?" Sophie immediately brightened again. Imagine bringing a billionaire to parent-teacher interviews. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. "Absolutely not." Liam grinned. "Worth asking." But beneath the joking, Charlotte noticed something else now. Excitement. Curiosity. Hope beginning to flicker quietly inside her children after one evening with Ethan. And hope was dangerous when attached to people who once disappeared. By 8:15, Charlotte walked the twins toward school beneath a sky threatening more rain. Trams rattled through crowded intersections while cafe windows fogged from morning coffee rushes. Sophie skipped ahead, balancing carefully along the edge of the pavement, while Liam kicked a bottle cap down the footpath like a football. Everything looked painfully ordinary. Yet Charlotte felt as though her entire world had shifted slightly off balance overnight. Halfway toward the school gates, a sleek black car slowly pulled alongside the curb beside them. Charlotte immediately stiffened. The passenger window lowered smoothly. Ethan sat inside wearing a dark coat over a crisp white shirt, his expression unusually uncertain for a man who controlled billion-dollar companies before breakfast. Liam's entire face lit up instantly. Sophie looked smug. "I knew rich people did school runs." Charlotte exhaled slowly. "Ethan." He stepped out of the car, despite the drizzle beginning again around them. "Morning." His eyes found the twins immediately, softening in that same dangerous way they had all evening yesterday. "I was nearby for a meeting." Sophie looked toward the empty street behind him. "In our suburb?" Ethan almost smiled. "Something like that." Charlotte crossed her arms lightly. "You do not need to invent excuses. Maybe I wanted to see them before school." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard completely. Liam held the football tighter beneath his arm. "Do you know anything about AFL?" Ethan blinked slightly. "I own part of a team." Liam stared at him in open horror. "You own football players?" Ethan laughed softly. "Not personally." Sophie looked deeply impressed. "Mum barely owns Tupperware lids." "Thank you, Sophie." Ethan crouched slightly, so he was level with Liam now. "Who do you barack for?" "Collingwood." Ethan pretended to wince dramatically. "That is unfortunate." Liam grinned immediately. "Who do you support?" "Carlton." Liam gasped loudly. "That is worse." Ethan laughed again, warmer this time, while Charlotte watched the entire exchange with growing unease. Because it looked natural. Too natural. Ethan spoke to Liam easily, comfortably, like some invisible thread already connected them beneath the surface. Sophie studied Ethan carefully beside them. You really came. Ethan looked toward her softly. I said I would. Something changed in Sophie's expression then. Very small. Very quiet. But Charlotte noticed it instantly because mothers always noticed. A tiny crack appearing in the wall her daughter built around disappointment. The school bell echoed faintly across the oval behind the gates while children hurried through the drizzle carrying oversized backpacks. Liam adjusted his football beneath one arm before looking back at Ethan. Do billionaires ever come to footy practice? Charlotte immediately intervened. Liam. But Ethan answered before she could stop him. If they are invited. Liam's face brightened so quickly it almost hurt to watch. Charlotte felt panic tighten beneath her ribs. This was exactly what she feared. Ethan stepping naturally into moments he never earned. Yet another part of her watched Liam smiling beside his father and felt something even more dangerous. Grief for all the years they lost. Sophie suddenly tugged on Ethan's coat sleeve. Do you know how to braid hair? Ethan blinked in complete surprise. I cannot say I do. Good. Sophie nodded seriously. That means you are probably honest. Ethan looked genuinely confused. About hair. Adults who pretend they can braid always make it worse. Ethan glanced helplessly toward Charlotte, who laughed before she could stop herself. The sound startled all of them slightly, because it had been years since laughter around Ethan felt natural instead of painful. Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her. Rain gathered softly along the shoulders of his dark coat, while morning traffic blurred behind him. And suddenly Charlotte remembered exactly why she once believed she would spend her entire life loving this man. The realization frightened her more than anything else. We should go, she said quietly. Liam nodded reluctantly while Sophie adjusted her backpack straps. Before following his sister toward the gates, Liam paused near Ethan. Hey. Ethan looked down immediately. Yeah, mate. Liam hesitated carefully before speaking. Thanks for coming. Ethan's expression changed instantly. Something deep and unguarded flickered across his face before he answered softly. There is nowhere else I would rather be. Charlotte stood frozen beneath the gray Melbourne sky, watching her son smile at his father without understanding the full truth yet. And somewhere deep inside her, she realized the most dangerous thing about Ethan Callaway was never his wealth or power. It was how quickly he already felt like family. By Thursday afternoon, Melbourne felt wrapped in one endless sheet of gray clouds and cold wind. Rainwater rushed along gutters while commuters hurried beneath umbrellas through crowded tram stops and glowing cafe windows. Inside Hayes' floral studio, Charlotte stood surrounded by eucalyptus branches and half-finished bouquets while soft acoustic music played from an old speaker near the counter. The tiny shop smelled of roses, damp leaves, and fresh coffee from next door. Normally, arranging flowers calmed her. The repetitive rhythm of trimming stems and tying ribbons usually silenced the noise inside her head. But not today, because every few minutes, her mind drifted back toward Ethan, toward Liam smiling beside him outside school, toward Sophie secretly checking the weather forecast to make sure Saturday's ballet recital would not be canceled, toward the terrifying possibility that her children were already beginning to love someone capable of leaving. The bell above the studio door suddenly rang. Charlotte looked up automatically before freezing. Ethan stood just inside the doorway holding 2 takeaway hot chocolates and looking painfully out of place among buckets of peonies and baby's breath. He wore a dark wool coat over rolled-up sleeves, rain still glistening faintly across his shoulders. For one brief second, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan lifted the drink tray slightly. Bribery. Charlotte stared at him carefully. You cannot just appear at my workplace. Technically, I entered through the front door. Despite herself, Charlotte almost smiled. Almost. Ethan glanced around the tiny studio slowly. This place suits you. Charlotte returned her attention to the bouquet in her hands. Why are you here? Ethan stepped closer carefully, as though approaching something fragile. Liam mentioned your Thursday deliveries usually run late. Charlotte immediately narrowed her eyes. You asked Liam about my schedule? No, Ethan looked mildly defensive. He volunteered detailed information about your inability to remember lunch. Charlotte sighed softly because unfortunately that sounded accurate. Ethan placed one hot chocolate beside her carefully. You forgot to eat again, did not you? Charlotte hated that he still knew her this well. I have been busy. Ethan glanced toward the overflowing workbench. Clearly, silence settled briefly between them while rain tapped softly against the shop windows. Outside, pedestrians hurried through the drizzle beneath flickering traffic lights. Ethan looked at the arrangements surrounding them. These are beautiful. You already said that at the gala. I meant it then too. Charlotte focused harder on tying ribbon around a bouquet, though her fingers suddenly felt less steady beneath his attention. Ethan slowly walked through the studio examining framed floral photographs hanging along the walls. You built all this yourself? Charlotte nodded once. Started with market stalls, then weddings, corporate events eventually. Ethan looked genuinely impressed. You built a business while raising twins alone. Women do impossible things every day. Ethan turned toward her quietly. You should not have had to. Charlotte immediately stiffened again. Do not do that. Do what? Look at me like I survived something tragic. Ethan's expression softened painfully. But you did. The honesty in his voice cracked through her defenses before she could stop it. Charlotte looked away toward the rain-streaked windows. Life happened. That is all. Ethan stepped closer slowly. Charlotte. No, her voice lowered carefully. You do not get to carry guilt for 10 years and suddenly turn it into redemption after 1 week. Ethan absorbed the words without argument, without defensiveness. Somehow that made it worse. I know, he said quietly. I am not trying to erase what happened. Charlotte crossed her arms tightly. Then what are you trying to do? Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering with devastating simplicity. Be present now. The words settled softly through the little flower shop, while rain continued tapping against the glass outside. Charlotte felt something painful shift inside her chest, because Ethan had always known how to say exactly the thing she least wanted to hear. Before she could answer, the studio door burst open dramatically. Mom! Sophie hurried inside, dripping rainwater everywhere, while Liam followed, carrying 2 oversized school bags and a football. Both children froze instantly upon seeing Ethan. Sophie's face lit up. You are here. Ethan smiled immediately. Apparently. Liam looked between the hot chocolates and the flowers suspiciously. Are you flirting? Charlotte nearly dropped the bouquet in her hands. Liam. Ethan coughed into his fist, trying unsuccessfully not to laugh. Mate, I think your mom would physically remove me from the building if I attempted that. Sophie looked deeply thoughtful. Fair. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. I am raising tiny emotional terrorists. But the twins already crowded around Ethan comfortably now. Too comfortably. Liam immediately began explaining football practice results while Sophie described ballet costume disasters with dramatic outrage. Ethan listened to every word with full attention, like nothing else in the world mattered more. Charlotte watched quietly from behind the workbench while something complicated twisted inside her chest. Because this was what hurt most. Ethan looked natural with them. Instinctive. Like fatherhood had always been waiting quietly inside him. Sophie suddenly frowned at the flowers stacked near the counter. Mom forgot to pick up my costume ribbons. Charlotte froze. What? Sophie groaned dramatically. The silver ribbons for Saturday. Charlotte's stomach dropped instantly. Between gala preparation and deliveries, she had completely forgotten. The costume shop closes in 20 minutes. Sophie whispered with genuine panic. Miss Harper said without matching ribbons I cannot perform. Charlotte reached immediately for her bag. Okay, I can still make it if traffic is not terrible. Ethan looked at the clock, then toward the rainstorm outside. You will never get across the city in time. Sophie's face visibly fell. Liam immediately tried comforting her. Maybe they will not notice. It is ballet, Sophie whispered in horror. They notice breathing. Ethan held out his hand calmly. Tell me the shop name. Charlotte looked at him instantly. Ethan, I can get there faster. Sophie's eyes widened hopefully. Charlotte hesitated because every instinct warned her not to let him keep stepping deeper into their lives. But Sophie looked one costume disaster away from tears. Ethan noticed the conflict in Charlotte's expression and softened his voice. Let me help. Finally, reluctantly, she handed him the address written on the back of a florist receipt. Ethan took it carefully like something important. Silver ribbons, he repeated seriously. Potential national emergency. Sophie nodded gravely. Extremely. 25 minutes later, Ethan returned soaked from rain, carrying not one packet of silver ribbons, but 5, plus emergency safety pins, plus replacement ballet tights because the sales assistant mentioned Sophie might need them eventually. Sophie stared at the shopping bag in complete awe. You bought backup ribbons. Ethan shrugged slightly while removing his wet coat. Preparedness seemed wise. Sophie launched herself forward suddenly and wrapped her arms around him before Charlotte could react. The entire flower shop went still. Ethan froze completely beneath the little girl's hug like his heart had forgotten how to function. Slowly, carefully, he rested one hand against Sophie's back. Charlotte watched the moment happen beneath warm shop lights and falling rain outside the windows. And for the first time since Ethan returned, she realized the real danger was not whether he would leave again. The real danger was that all three of them were already beginning to need him not to. Saturday arrived wrapped in pale winter sunlight and sharp Melbourne wind. The clouds from earlier in the week had finally broken apart, leaving streaks of gold across the morning sky, while trams rattled through busy intersections and cafe patios filled with weekend crowds. Inside the small apartment above the convenience shop, complete chaos had already erupted by 8 o'clock. "Where's my other ballet shoe?" Sophie's voice echoed dramatically through the flat, while Charlotte searched beneath couch cushions holding safety pins between her teeth. Liam sat cross-legged on the floor eating cereal directly from the box, while football highlights played softly from the television. "You left it in the bathroom," he announced without looking up. "You leave everything in the bathroom." "That is not true. Last week Mum found your maths homework beside the shampoo." Sophie gasped. "That was strategic placement." Charlotte laughed softly despite the nervous tension twisting inside her chest. Because Ethan was coming today. And somehow, over the past 48 hours, that fact had quietly transformed the emotional atmosphere of the entire household. Sophie changed outfits 3 times before breakfast. Liam pretended not to care while secretly asking if Ethan would stay long enough afterward to kick a football around the park. Even Charlotte caught herself checking the apartment mirror twice before immediately feeling ridiculous afterward. At 10:15 sharp, a knock sounded at the door downstairs. Sophie nearly sprinted into the wall, trying to reach it first. "Careful," Charlotte called automatically while pinning Sophie's ballet ribbon into place. Liam looked toward the window and grinned suddenly. He brought coffee. Sophie opened the apartment door seconds later, and Ethan stepped inside carrying a cardboard tray of drinks along with a paper bag from the bakery down the street. He wore dark jeans and a charcoal jumper instead of expensive suits today, his hair slightly windswept from the cold outside. Somehow, dressed casually inside their tiny apartment, he looked younger, softer, more like the man Charlotte once knew before power hardened him around the edges. "Morning," Ethan said quietly. Sophie immediately took the bakery bag from his hands. "You brought emergency croissants." "Excellent instincts." Ethan looked toward Charlotte over Sophie's shoulder, amusement flickering in his eyes. "I am learning survival strategies." Charlotte accepted the coffee carefully while trying not to notice how natural he suddenly looked standing inside her kitchen. Liam wandered over from the couch holding a football beneath one arm. "Did billionaires always know where local bakeries are?" Ethan shrugged lightly. "I asked 3 people. That seems inefficient. I employ smarter people during weekdays." Sophie opened the pastry bag and gasped dramatically. "Chocolate croissants." She looked at Ethan with genuine reverence now. "You might actually be useful." Charlotte covered her smile with the coffee cup before Ethan could notice. But of course he noticed anyway. He always noticed her smiles. The apartment slowly filled with warmth from coffee steam and bakery sugar, while sunlight spilled softly through the kitchen windows. Ethan leaned casually against the counter listening to Liam explain football. Ladder rankings with complete seriousness while Sophie practiced ballet turns dangerously close to the table. For several impossible moments, it felt less like a visit and more like something heartbreakingly ordinary. Like family. Charlotte hated how much that thought hurt. An hour later, they arrived at the school performing arts hall where parents crowded beside folding chairs carrying flowers, cameras, and takeaway coffees. Children in bright costumes hurried nervously through backstage doors, while piano music drifted faintly from inside the auditorium. Sophie clutched Charlotte's hand tightly until Ethan crouched beside her near the entrance. "You nervous?" Sophie nodded solemnly. "My stomach feels haunted." Ethan smiled softly. That usually means you care about doing well. Sophie considered this carefully. You really think so? Absolutely. He straightened the edge of her ballet cardigan gently. And for what it is worth, I think you are going to be incredible. Sophie stared at him for one long, quiet moment before wrapping her arms around him again without warning. Ethan froze briefly before hugging her back carefully, his eyes closing for half a second like he still could not quite believe this was real. Charlotte looked away toward the auditorium doors because suddenly her chest hurt too much to watch. The recital began shortly afterward beneath bright stage lights and nervous applause. Parents filled the small hall while children moved across the stage in carefully rehearsed formations. Ethan sat beside Charlotte in the second row, one arm resting against the back of the empty seat between them while Liam whispered constant football commentary during performances completely unrelated to football. Why are all ballet songs so sad? He whispered at one point. Because no one has choreographed dance to heavy metal yet. Ethan whispered back seriously. Liam nearly laughed loud enough to get them removed from the hall. Charlotte shook her head softly beside them, but warmth still spread unexpectedly through her chest hearing the two of them together. Then the lights dimmed for Sophie's group performance. Soft piano music floated through the auditorium, while little girls in silver costumes stepped carefully onto the stage beneath glowing spotlights. Charlotte immediately sat straighter. Ethan's attention sharpened beside her. And there she was. Sophie Hayes, blonde hair perfectly pinned back, silver ribbons tied carefully at her wrists, small shoulders squared bravely beneath stage lights brighter than any 10-year-old should have to face alone. She looked terrified. Ethan noticed instantly. She is looking for you, he whispered softly. Charlotte realized he was right. Sophie's eyes kept scanning the crowd nervously while the music continued. Then suddenly Sophie spotted them sitting together near the front row. Something in her expression changed immediately. Relief, safety, confidence. She smiled. And just like that, her entire posture transformed. Sophie lifted her chin and began dancing with a grace that silenced the entire room. Ethan stared at the stage without blinking once. Charlotte glanced sideways toward him briefly and saw tears shining faintly in his eyes beneath the dim auditorium lights. Not dramatic tears, quiet ones, the kind people carried alone. When the performance ended, applause thundered through the hall while children bowed beneath the stage lights. Sophie searched the audience again immediately until her eyes landed on Ethan. He rose to his feet before anyone else, clapping harder than anyone in the room. Pride radiated openly across his face now, unfiltered, unhidden. Charlotte suddenly felt tears sting unexpectedly behind her own eyes because no matter how hard she tried to protect herself from it, this moment mattered. It mattered that Ethan showed up. It mattered that he looked at Sophie like she hung the stars herself. It mattered that Liam already leaned toward him instinctively whenever something funny happened. And perhaps worst of all, it mattered that part of Charlotte still loved the way Ethan looked at all three of them like they were the best thing he had ever found. The applause from the recital still echoed faintly in Charlotte's ears as families spilled out of the school hall into the chilly Melbourne afternoon. Parents carried bouquets wrapped in pastel paper while children raced across the oval in costumes and oversized hoodies. The sky above the city had cleared completely now, soft sunlight reflecting off damp pavement left behind by days of rain. Sophie walked between Charlotte and Ethan clutching a small bunch of flowers from her ballet teacher, while Liam kicked a football ahead of them toward the park across the street. Did you see my turn near the end? Sophie asked for approximately the 7th time. Ethan nodded seriously. Professional level. Sophie looked deeply satisfied by this answer. I knew it. Charlotte watched them quietly while a strange ache settled beneath her ribs again. Because Ethan did not speak to the twins like a visitor trying too hard. He listened naturally, remembered details, paid attention in ways children noticed immediately. Liam suddenly pointed toward the grassy oval nearby. One kick. Charlotte opened her mouth to protest, but Ethan had already removed his coat. One kick, he promised. 20 minutes later, Charlotte sat alone on a weathered park bench beneath gum trees, while watching Ethan and Liam chase a football across the grass like they had known each other forever. Sophie sat beside Charlotte, nibbling the corner of a chocolate muffin Ethan bought from the cafe near the school. Mom. Charlotte glanced down. Sophie leaned against her shoulder carefully. I think he loves us. The words hit softly, dangerously softly. Charlotte stared toward the oval where Ethan laughed after missing an easy mark, while Liam celebrated dramatically like he had won the grand final. "Soph, I know," Sophie interrupted quietly. "He left." Charlotte looked down at her daughter in surprise. Sophie rarely spoke directly about painful things. But people who do not care do not look at you like that. Charlotte's throat tightened unexpectedly. Because children noticed love long before adults admitted it existed. Across the park, Ethan finally collapsed onto the grass beside Liam, both of them breathless and laughing beneath the pale winter sun. Charlotte felt something painful unfold quietly inside her chest. Grief for moments stolen from all of them. First football games. First school. Concerts. First birthdays. Ethan missed all of it. And somehow, despite everything, she hated that for him almost as much as she hated it for herself. Ethan and Liam eventually returned flushed from running, while Sophie immediately demanded hot chips from the nearby cafe. 10 minutes later, all four of them sat around a tiny outdoor table beside the park kiosk, while gulls circled overhead and children played on swings nearby. For one impossible moment, they looked painfully normal. A family eating hot chips on a Saturday afternoon beneath Melbourne sunlight. Ethan sat across from Charlotte watching Liam explain football statistics with complete confidence, while Sophie stole chips from everyone equally. Then Ethan's phone rang. The atmosphere changed instantly. Not dramatically, just enough for Charlotte to notice. Ethan glanced at the screen, and something guarded slipped immediately back into his expression. The billionaire returned. "I need to take this," he said quietly. Liam nodded while reaching for more chips. Ethan stepped several meters away near the edge of the oval, lowering his voice as he answered. Charlotte tried not to listen, but then she heard one sentence clearly carried across the wind. "No, they do not know yet." Her stomach tightened instantly. Ethan turned slightly farther away after that, speaking more quietly, while tension settled visibly through his posture. Charlotte watched him carefully, the sharpness returning to his shoulders, the corporate control sliding back over him like armor. Sophie followed Charlotte's gaze. He looked sad again. Charlotte forced herself to look away. Adults get stressed. But unease had already started blooming quietly beneath her ribs. 10 minutes later, Ethan returned with an apologetic expression. "I am sorry. Something came up." Liam frowned immediately. "You have to leave?" Ethan hesitated. The answer was clearly supposed to be yes. Charlotte could see habit pulling at him, the old machinery of obligation and reputation and urgent male voices on the other end of phones. Then his gaze moved to Sophie, who had gone very still while pretending to study a chip. Ethan looked back at the phone in his hand, pressed one button, and turned it completely off. "No," he said quietly. "I do not." Charlotte blinked. "Ethan, work can wait." His voice was calm, but something in it had changed. Children should not have to. Sophie's eyes lifted toward him then, careful and searching. "You are not going?" Ethan crouched beside her chair. "Not unless your mother asks me to." Charlotte felt emotion burn unexpectedly behind her eyes because this, more than speeches and expensive gestures, was what frightened her most. A man could say sorry beautifully and still disappear. But staying in a small, ordinary moment when leaving would be easier, this was different. Ethan looked at Liam next. "Rain check on the next kick, though? I may need ice." Liam grinned. "You are very bad at football. I am beginning to realize that." Warmth almost returned to the table. Almost. Then a sleek black sedan pulled into the car park beside the cafe. A woman stepped out wearing dark sunglasses and an expensive cream coat despite the sunlight. Charlotte recognized her instantly even after 10 years. Evelyn Calloway. Every ounce of warmth vanished from Charlotte's body immediately. Ethan froze too. The twins looked between the adults in confusion while Evelyn approached across the pavement with controlled elegance that had once terrified Charlotte at 21. Time had not softened her so much as polished the same hardness into something quieter. Her eyes landed first on Ethan, then on Charlotte, then finally on the twins sitting at the cafe table. And the entire world seemed to stop breathing. Sophie instinctively moved closer to Charlotte's side, while Liam frowned uncertainly. Evelyn's composure cracked for one microscopic second as she looked directly at Liam's face. Ethan stepped forward immediately. "Mother." His voice carried warning beneath the calm. Evelyn ignored him at first. Her gaze remained fixed on the twins. "Dear God." Charlotte's pulse thundered painfully in her ears. 10 years ago, This woman destroyed her future with a few quiet words inside a cathedral hallway. And now she stood directly in front of the children Ethan never knew existed. Evelyn finally looked toward Charlotte. Slowly, disbelief and something dangerously close to guilt flickering beneath her polished expression. You had his children. Charlotte lifted her chin despite her shaking hands. Yes. Silence crashed over the little cafe patio while traffic moved faintly beyond the park and gulls circled overhead. Evelyn's lips parted as if an apology might appear easily. It did not. Some words came too late to arrive clean. At last, she whispered the one sentence Charlotte had once dreamed of hearing and no longer knew what to do with. I made a terrible mistake. The winter wind moved softly through the park, carrying the distant sound of children laughing near the swings and tram bells echoing from the street beyond the oval. Yet around the small cafe table, silence settled so heavily it almost felt physical. Charlotte stared at Evelyn Calloway across the pavement while old memories rushed back with painful clarity. White cathedral walls, satin wedding dress, quiet humiliation beneath stained glass windows, and Evelyn's calm voice telling her to disappear quietly for everyone's sake. 10 years later, the same woman now stood frozen in front of the grandchildren she never knew existed. Sophie instinctively slipped her hand into Charlotte's while Liam looked between the adults in visible confusion. Ethan remained perfectly still beside the table, tension radiating beneath his calm expression. Mother, he repeated carefully. Evelyn finally blinked as though returning to reality. Her eyes moved toward the twins again, lingering on Liam's unmistakable resemblance to Ethan before settling on Sophie's guarded expression. Something fragile cracked quietly across her face. How old are they? Charlotte answered before Ethan could. 9. Evelyn visibly swallowed. 9 years. Her voice lowered almost to herself. My God. Liam looked up at Ethan uncertainly. Do you know her? Ethan hesitated briefly before nodding. Yes, mate. Sophie frowned immediately. Mate means yes, but emotionally complicated. Ethan almost smiled despite the tension. That is surprisingly accurate. Evelyn slowly approached the table, though she stopped several feet away from the twins like she understood instinctively that she had not earned the right to come closer. For the first time since Charlotte met her, Evelyn Calloway looked uncertain, smaller somehow beneath the sharp Melbourne sunlight. Charlotte, Evelyn said softly, I did not know. Charlotte's laugh came quietly and without humor. No, you only destroyed our lives accidentally. Ethan stepped beside Charlotte, but did not silence her this time. That mattered. Years ago, everyone in his world had spoken over her pain. Today he let it stand. You told me I would ruin Ethan's future, Charlotte continued, her voice trembling despite every effort to steady it. You stood in that cathedral and made me feel like loving your son was something shameful. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. I thought I was protecting him. From what? Charlotte whispered. Happiness. The question landed hard enough that even Ethan looked away. Nearby, gulls circled above the oval while sunlight reflected off wet park benches left behind by the week's rainstorms. The ordinary afternoon continued around them, completely unaware that decades of regret were unfolding beside the cafe tables. Evelyn looked toward the twins again, and Charlotte saw genuine grief flicker beneath her polished composure. They are beautiful children. Sophie immediately crossed her arms. Mum says beautiful people should still apologize properly. Liam looked impressed. That was brutal. Ethan's mouth twitched once, but he said nothing. Evelyn stared at Sophie for several long seconds before something unexpected happened. The elegant, untouchable Evelyn Calloway lowered herself slowly into the empty chair across from Charlotte and spoke with a softness Charlotte had never heard from her before. You are right. Sophie blinked slightly, clearly unprepared for agreement. Evelyn folded her hands carefully together. Charlotte, her voice faltered briefly. I owe you an apology far too late. Charlotte looked away immediately because somehow anger had always been easier to carry than remorse. You loved my son, Evelyn continued quietly, and I punished you for not fitting into the world I wanted for him. Ethan stared at his mother in complete silence. I thought wealth and power would protect him from pain. Evelyn's eyes filled faintly now. Instead, I helped create the greatest pain of his life. Charlotte swallowed hard while wind moved softly through the gum trees above them. An apology is not a time machine, she said. Evelyn nodded, tears gathering without falling. I know. It will not give Liam his first kick with his father. It will not put Ethan beside Sophie when she cried before her first recital. It will not return the nights I worked until my hands went numb because rent was due and pride was all I had left. Evelyn bowed her head. I know. This time the words did not sound defensive. They sounded small. Liam looked between everyone with growing understanding beginning to form behind his eyes. Children always sense truth before adults realized it. Wait, he said slowly. Are you Dad's mom? Silence followed immediately. Sophie's eyes widened beside him. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Charlotte felt her heartbeat stumble painfully inside her chest. The moment had arrived whether any of them were ready or not. Evelyn looked at Liam with tears shining openly now. Yes, she whispered. I am. Liam stared at Ethan next, then back toward Charlotte. Dad. The word fell softly into the winter air, but it shattered something open inside all of them. Ethan looked completely undone by it. Not the billionaire. Not the public figure. Just a father hearing his son call him Dad for the very first time. Charlotte watched his breathing visibly shake before he crouched slowly beside Liam's chair. Yeah, mate. Ethan whispered hoarsely. I am your dad. Liam looked stunned more than emotional. Like a puzzle piece suddenly sliding into place after years missing from the picture. Sophie looked at Ethan carefully beside him. So you really are ours? Ethan turned toward her immediately. If you will let me be. Sophie studied him with heartbreaking seriousness. Are you going to disappear again? The question silenced everything. Wind. Traffic. Thoughts. Ethan looked at Sophie like the entire world rested inside her small, frightened voice. Then he reached into his pocket, took out his phone, and placed it on the table between them. This used to decide where I went, he said quietly. Meetings. Calls. Other people's emergencies. He looked at Charlotte, then back at the twins. I let grown-ups convince me that love could wait. I was wrong. His voice broke slightly. Love does not wait. Children do not wait. Life keeps growing whether you are there or not. Sophie's lips trembled. Ethan did not touch her without permission. He only stayed kneeling, open hands resting on his knees, letting her choose. I cannot promise I will never make a mistake, he whispered. But I can promise I will not make you chase me for my attention. I will show up. Not once. Not when it is easy. Every week. Every birthday. Every boring school meeting. Every ordinary day your mother allows. Charlotte felt tears finally escape despite every wall she had built against them. Because she did not believe everything was fixed. God, no. But she believed this moment. Liam suddenly threw his arms around Ethan without warning. Ethan froze only half a second before holding his son tightly against his chest, like someone terrified to let go. Sophie hesitated longer. Then quietly, almost shyly, she moved closer too until Ethan wrapped one arm around her as well. Charlotte looked away toward the sunlight shimmering across the wet oval because the sight hurt too beautifully to watch directly. Evelyn wiped tears from beneath her sunglasses silently across the table. For the first time in her life, the powerful Calloway family looked less like untouchable billionaires and more like ordinary people mourning years they could never recover. A football rolled slowly across the grass nearby, before stopping near Charlotte's shoes. She bent automatically to pick it up, but Ethan looked up at her then, still kneeling beside their children, still holding them like they mattered more than anything he had ever owned. I know I cannot undo the past, he said softly. And I know forgiveness is not something I can ask for just because I finally understand what I lost. Charlotte held his gaze. No, she whispered. It is not. Ethan nodded. The answer hurt him. She saw that. But he accepted it. Then let me earn trust before I ask for anything else. 3 months later, Charlotte stood at the edge of the same school oval beneath a spring sky, while Liam's football team ran drills across the grass. Sophie sat beside her on a picnic blanket, tying silver ribbons around the handle of Ethan's coffee cup because she said everything looked better with accessories. Across the field, Ethan stood with other parents near the boundary line wearing ordinary jeans, shouting encouragement far too loudly whenever Liam touched the ball. He had missed meetings. He had sat through parent-teacher interviews. He had learned to braid badly, burn pancakes only once, and wait outside Charlotte's flower studio every Thursday without expecting to be invited in. Evelyn came sometimes too, never empty-handed, never demanding affection, always asking Charlotte first whether it was all right. Nothing was perfect. Some evenings still hurt. Some conversations still ended in silence. But Ethan kept coming back. Not with grand speeches. With lunchboxes. Homework. Recital flowers. Football boots. Time. Liam kicked the ball cleanly through the posts and turned immediately toward the boundary. Dad, did you see? Ethan's face opened with pride, so bright Charlotte had to look down for a second. I saw everything, mate. Sophie leaned against Charlotte's shoulder. He still cries too easily. Charlotte smiled through the ache in her chest. Maybe that is not such a bad thing. Ethan looked across the oval then, his eyes finding Charlotte the way they once had in another lifetime. He did not ask for forgiveness from that distance. He did not need to. He simply lifted one hand in a small, quiet promise. I am here. Charlotte lifted her hand back. Not because the past was erased. Not because pain had vanished. But because she had finally learned the difference between a man who says he is sorry and a man who stays long enough for the apology to become a life. Some people lose love because fate is cruel. Others lose it because they are afraid to fight for it. But the greatest lesson Charlotte Hayes ever gave her children was this. Family is not proven by blood, money, or beautiful words. Family is proven by the people who keep showing up after the applause is gone, after the doors are closed, and after staying becomes the only apology that truly matters.